Hello, good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. I was trying to go in, but I couldn't properly log in, but I'm all right now.
No problem, Christina. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Let's give it a minute or so to see if anybody else is joining us. I know Solar was. All right, okay, that's great.
Thank you, sir.
Let's give it a minute or so to see if anybody else is joining us. I know Solar was. All right, okay, that's great. Right, so let's start off with regards to our discussion. We are looking at covering learning outcome 3 and learning outcome 4 today in the academic and research skills. So let me just switch you over to the unit specification. We've got this that we've been using to discuss this particular unit, which is academic and research skills in health and social care. So we've done learning outcome 2 so far. First was to look at basically assessing our own skills and abilities on English language, academic writing, IT skills, and then looking at developing using SWOT analysis and SMART personal development plan in order to look at putting some improvement targets in place for the purposes of let's say improving our weaknesses or areas in terms of threats. In the second learning outcome, we basically looked at going into understanding why do we need research, what are the different types of research, primary, secondary, and tertiary research. We also looked at what are the various methods through which data can be collected, why is it collected specifically in health and social care sector, how this is utilized by various agencies, people working within this sector to provide integrated care. And obviously the overarching aim here was to understand what is research and what is primary research, what is secondary research. Then we looked at towards the end examples of what constitutes good practices in terms of collecting data using sources of primary research and secondary research. So things like questionnaires, surveys, feedback forms, interviews, focus groups, they all tend to be primary research. And then we talk about secondary research, which is desk-based. That means we are not collecting the information firsthand. It is slightly cheaper to do secondary research because primary research is done when you're collecting the information at the source. And in secondary research, we look at data which is published on websites, electronic material, journals, articles, existing reports, government agencies which produce data like the Office of National Statistics and other agencies which are research agencies, and they produce reports. They are used, to get data which can be used for decision making. And we looked at widely the example of COVID pandemic, wherein there was no data available. Most of the research so far has been primary. And then as this data and the research has been gathered in various countries through various sources, the data which is got collected now can be utilized for doing further research and, obviously to look into further findings in terms of new variants of Omicron, COVID Omicron, which are coming through and obviously how to make vaccines more effective. Now, in the third learning outcome, we are going to be focused on understanding how do we take effective notes from a variety of sources. Now, one of the key things that we look at within the health and social care sector and people who work within this sector, when we talk about, things like person-centered values, one of the key things that we need to look at, in this sector is that most people, when they work with patients and provided, and say, for example, with variety of people and they provide care, what tends to happen is that one of the things which becomes quite important is the factor or the skill of communication. And also, when we look at communication, people within the sector which work as healthcare professionals also have the concept of the person-centered care, which is individuality, independence, privacy, partnership, choice, dignity, respect, and the ability to be able to respect rights and preferences of individuals. One of the things that we look at in particular would be related to communication and the ability to be able to be a good listener. So sometimes we get to hear that people within the sector who work and have full-time jobs, they are very perseverant, they are patient, they have the ability to be able to listen to others, and they can provide a bit of a, let's put it this way, a shoulder to people when they want to talk and they want to discuss about let's say they want to discuss and talk about certain problems, issues. One second, long back. So in some cases, what tends to happen is that you would see that this as a skill, in terms of listening as a skill, becomes quite important. And the reason why this becomes important is that people need to be able to pay attention and effectively listen to what other people are saying. So they should be able to interpret by listening into what other people are saying, and that is where listening becomes important. So here in this particular learning outcome, we are going to be looking at to understand how note-taking as a process is done by using listening skills. Now, one of the things that we also did an audit initially in the first learning outcome was our English language skills. So when I look at, English language skills, you have English language, which has 4 components. So when we talk about speaking, listening, we talk about then reading and writing. But when we talk about listening is one of the key bits wherein when we look at the communication process, what you generally see is the person who's speaking, in this case me, I'm the sender. The message that I'm talking about as of now, this lecture, is then being transmitted through some technology in the middle, and it is then being received by the learners on the other end, who are the receiver. And when you ask a question, or when you say, for example, give me some clue that yes, you are understanding this tends to be the feedback. So when we talk about the communication process in general, the communication process can be a 5-step process. Sender, in between the message is being used, is being communicated using technology. So it is being encrypted, going over the internet, gets decrypted at your end. You are the receiver who receives it. When you give feedback or clues that you are understanding what I'm saying, is basically then coming back to me, and that is completing the process of communication. So listening is an important bit of the communication process, and this is where note-taking becomes comes in quite handy. So specifically when you have to, I'll give you a simple example of a situation that when you go and see your GP at the surgery, the GP is quite patient and obviously all ears to you in terms of understanding your problem. So they will ask you a few questions, and then you are going to be saying what are the reasons or what are the symptoms that you're facing, and the doctor is then looking and making notes. Now, this process through which the doctor listens into you as a patient to understand your situation, or to understand your pain, or understand what kind of symptoms you're facing because of the problem that you're trying to describe, is a process of listening. Now, listening can be of different types, and why is it used as a process, as a technique, as a skill, because of the fact that we want to be able to listen into people, especially in this case patients, we need to pay attention to what they are saying and then effectively interpret what that information means by taking notes. And this could be done in the form of medical notes that we make, notes that you're taking in on a form, for example. Sometimes when you ask questions about things like, when you go up to the receptionist might ask you, okay, can I know your name, your date of birth, just to confirm, and then you give your address. So basic details like demographics are being captured, because the idea is that the patient record has to be kept accurate. Who does this record belong to? Conditions that you have, say for example, previous medication that you have received, or previous illnesses that you have had, or in some cases, if you've had, say for example, some sort of diagnosis and that has led to a certain amount of surgery or operative procedures, what is the background to that? All that is tend to be captured in as a record in the patient history. Now, that record is being created because somebody when I say somebody, either a healthcare assistant, nurse, maybe the GP, or one of the practice staffs within the surgery is actually listening in to the patient and making notes. And this process is basically note-taking. So this learning outcome that we're going to study is going to be looking at being able to effectively understand how to collect information from a variety of sources, and then how do we use the process of active listening. And, this then is utilized in the process of making notes. Now, this particular learning outcome has two assessment criteria that we will be covering. Very briefly, one, collate key points of information from a variety of sources using active listening and reading strategies. And the second would be summarize the information using different techniques. So what we are going to do is go through a bit of presentation and a video, and that would primarily, give us a bit more understanding in terms of what is the process of, listening, and how do we look at active listening as a process, in particular, as an activity to be then able to take notes effectively. Now, one of the things which is going to come across time and again, and what I want to do is basically cover it here, is to understand what is note-taking. Now, note-taking is something that we have been trained, or at least we picked up as a, we've been trained to do, and this is something that we have learned way back from our school days. So when we talk about the process of, note-taking, the process of note-taking tends to be when somebody's talking, and what you're doing is, if literally, if I discuss this or describe it, is that sometimes you're taking, you're writing down key points which are being spoken about in order for you to recall and remember what was discussed. So something that we are aware of, which we used to do when we were in schools in the early days, obviously when the teacher is teaching in the class, sometimes what we used to do is, although we used to get printouts or maybe photocopies of what was being taught, but we used to also make notes, of what the lecture was or what the teacher was teaching in the class in our own words. So essentially, when we talk about note-taking, it helps us to improve the understanding of what we are trying to, let's say, filter in terms of information from a variety of sources. And what you're doing is basically writing that in your own words, so that if you need to revisit that in the future, you have your own notes to understand what was the content, or what was the matter which was discussed. Now, note-taking can be done in very many ways. Sometimes you see people within the offices also use a recorder. And if I give you an example, in some cases, when you look at offices and the employment of secretaries, sometimes people in the management, what they use is they use a recorder. And if they had to dictate cases, specifically in the legal sector or in the medical sector, medicine sector, what we look at is, it could be prevalent everywhere, but just looking at giving an example in this case is that when management or people in management used to give out, were looking at dictating, notes for typing out a letter, or say research projects or research reports, they used to use a recorder. And what they do is they dictaphone or a recorder, and they would basically switch on the recorder and start talking about it. And later on, what they would do is then give that recorder to the secretary, who would then type it out using a typewriter in the olden days, and obviously now using a PC, type out a report or type out a presentation, or whatever that letter source of information has been. So note taking can be done in many ways, and this tends to be the process through which you are recording information from different sources. It could be through electronic medium, through recording of information that you're speaking, or making your own personal notes. And this is primarily done to record information, recall information in the future, which you would want to do at a later stage, and you would want to simply write down that information in your own words. So the practice of recording information from different sources and different platforms, or using different platforms, can be defined as a definition of note-taking. Now, why this has become important? Because of the fact that sometimes when you're attending meetings, seminars, conferences, you are in a class, or for example, you are discussing or having a discussion on important topic related to a patient. So sometimes you would see that if patients have to undergo some sort of a surgery, normally there is a consultation which is done with a consultant or a GP or a doctor and the practice nurse and the clinical staff, which basically will take the patient through even before the operative procedure or the surgery happens. Now, in this case, the consultation requires somebody to take notes that all the aspects of the surgery have been explained to the patient. For example, how long will the operation take? What are the chances of any, failures? Or for example, what could be the rate in terms of failure rate of the operation? What could be the consequences of the operation if things don't go as planned? All these things, and what are the advantages, or how would you get cured once the operation has happened? How long will the recovery take? Lots of these questions that are discussed in consultation with the patient who's undergoing or is looking at undergoing some sort of surgery would be all done through the process of discussion with the patient, and somebody in the team would then be also making notes to make records. One of the key reasons that we need to understand is, why do we do note taking? Is to make a record, whether that is a record made verbally by recording or by writing it down on a paper. But the idea there and thereabouts is to take and make records. So this process through which the patient goes through is a consultation. Somebody is noting it down, and at a later date, a letter is also posted from the consultant and the GP to the patient, and along with that you get normally some leaflets which are given for additional reading, so that if you have any further queries or any doubts about the operative procedure, they can come back and discuss that out with their GP or the clinical nurse. And this process tends to be, knowingly or unknowingly, we are going through this process, but this process tends to be what is called the process of note-taking. Now, what are the main reasons? One, because we want to create records. Second, when you're reading and listening and you're taking notes, you're basically making notes in your own way to be able to recall this information for the future. And when we are trying to make notes, what we are trying to do is write down keywords or key aspects of what has been discussed in terms of key bits of information, which is what you are able to understand going forward, and that helps to recall the discussion or the topic of discussion which was taking place at that point in time when you refer to your notes. So note taking, important bit, because of the fact that you are able to create documentation and records, specifically patient records. And there, the main importance of recording this information is to collate information from different sources and platforms. And this is then used to sometimes take decisions also, or in the future, in order to recall things which were discussed. And this is why this process of note-taking, becomes important. Now, when I say note-making, and I say note-taking, there's a difference. Note-making would be a person who's designated as the minutes or meeting of if you're having a meeting, somebody who's taking down the minutes of the meeting would be termed as note maker. That means the person is essentially tasked with taking notes for the meeting. And then when we talk about note-taking, it is a passive process which is done at lectures. And I gave you an example that during our childhood days when we were attending classes or when we went to university and we were attending lectures, we were making notes which would help us stay focused and recall the discussion or the topic which was being discussed at a later stage by taking or by noting down the context of that lecture in our own words. So note taking versus note making, there's a slight bit of difference, and obviously note taking is an important process. Note making, obviously, yes, sometimes what you do is you if you are in the minutes of the meeting, you would make or pretty much note down the important points. But when I look at the formal process through which note taking is done to fill up forms, create official records of documentation, note taking as a process becomes important because the accuracy of the notes, the factuality of the notes is used to create an understanding in terms of what is required to be done in the case of patient. And that is why patient records, when they are created, note taking or the nurse who's making the notes while on rounds with the GP, or the GP, while on rounds with the consultant, is going to note down important bits which have been discussed or prescribed by the consultant with the patient during the rounds being taken, and there is a set specific format which needs to be filled up. So you just don't muddle up and write all the information in one page, but there would be things or places clearly marked wherein these notes would then be taken. So for example, when I look at taking notes, there would be specific areas in the patient record to record things like, is the patient diabetic? Is the patient having high blood pressure? Does the patient have any allergies? And, is the patient sensitive to penicillin or, some of the drugs? So these are areas in which you have clear process through which either the answer to be noted or the response to be noted is very clearly yes or very clearly no, and it can't be a muddled up answer. And that is where note taking in patient records or medical records tend to be a case wherein you tick yes or you tick no, and that is where, or you say not applicable, and that is where this process becomes an important process, because if this information is not noted accurately, then sometimes while prescribing medicine or for example when medicines have to be administered, and if this has not been noted down that the patient is allergic to penicillin, this could cause reverse untoward reactions, and it can even lead to the death of the patient or maybe other complications if the patient has underlying conditions. So in those cases, note taking becomes an important process, specifically when we look at patient records. Now, generically, what we want to quickly understand before we get into the assessment criteria is that why is note taking considered a skill? Now, if I look at mentioning that in the olden days, when I say olden days, I'm going back 20 years when typewriters were being used 25 years back, note taking used to be a specific skill because secretaries in particular, clerks in the courts, or people within the legal profession who are basically designated as data operators, they used to understand and use a language called shorthand. Now, when you were asked to go into meetings and obviously asked to take notes or minutes of the meeting, the language or, for example, one of the methods through which these people were able to write down quite quickly the summary of the meeting or write down notes. Specifically, you see that in the Parliament as well. When proceedings are happening in the House of Commons, House of Lords, there are a few people who are sitting in the center and they tend to be taking notes. And this is done through the technique of what is called shorthand. Now, shorthand is an abbreviated symbolic writing method that increases the speed and the brevity of writing as compared to longhand. So when we have to make proper sentences, for example, I would say, I am going to do a lecture on academic and research skills, learning outcome 3 and 4 today. Now, if I were to use this and say the same bit of information and write it down for the purposes of record, now I would either expect the speaker to slow down so that I could make notes very quickly, or in some cases, I need to be aware of a skill which is called shorthand, which is basically a symbolic method of writing using symbols. And this allows me to, quickly and, quickly take notes of what is being discussed. And this common method was basically used by people like clerks, secretaries, private secretaries, and people working within certain professions. And this process of writing in shorthand, also called stenography, this is also referred to as stenography apart from shorthand. And steno is a Greek word which means narrow, and graphy means to write. So stenography is basically narrow writing in literal meaning, was used as a technique to basically take notes in important meetings or in proceedings which are happening within court or elsewhere. Now, over the years, obviously, what we have seen is that the process of note taking has come a long way. And what has happened is there are different methods which have been proposed in order for us to take notes. Now, there are 3, 4, 5 methods, but what I would want to do is basically, just for the purposes of our understanding, we want to be able to understand what are the 3 most important or most commonly used method of taking notes. Now, the 3 common methods of taking notes are outline method. There is something called the mind mapping or the summary method, and there is something called the Cornell system or the Cornell method. Now, these 3 methods have become quite synonymous with the process of what is called, note taking. So when we talk about, the process of note taking, we basically look at these 3 methods which are widely used. Now, the outlining method, as we would say, just very briefly, making you understand here, is perhaps the most commonly used method of note taking, specifically used by college students, or by students or learners in general. Now, the outline method naturally looks at organizing the information in a structured manner, in a logical manner, and it forms a bit of a skeleton of what could be described as the table of content in a textbook. Say, for example, if you're reading, if you're looking at finding out the contents of the book, what we do is generally go into the table of contents. So what you end up doing is you write down important bits of information which are highly structured in a logical manner, that if I do this, then I will do that. Then it follows through in a fashion wherein it allows you to make notes which can later be then serving as an excellent guide for you to prepare for tests. And that is what tends to be the outline method. So here you're looking at maybe using bullet points, you're looking at using arrows and a bit of flow charts, and you're basically looking at writing down the main topics and subtopics of discussion, which is what you're capturing by using the outline method. So next method that we look at, which has become quite popular and synonymous with the fact, is that this is referred to as the Cornell note-taking method. Now, this particular method basically focuses on, understanding, let's say, obviously uses a structured approach, but this method primarily, looks at taking and organizing and reviewing the notes, which was proposed initially by a professor in the Cornell University, and that's why it's become the Cornell method. And he had proposed this method in the early 1950s. Now, this method requires a bit of preparation. So what you tend to do is you basically divide, your the page or the document on which you're taking the notes into 4 zones. So you have title on the top, and then you have the left-hand side wherein you're basically going to write down the keywords or the questions, and then on the right-hand side, you basically record the information related to that topic. And towards the end, you draw a line wherein you basically then summarize what has been discussed and in terms of what notes you have taken. So this tends to be a case wherein you divide the paper into 4 parts and 4 sections of 4 parts. And in this case, the 2 columns that you see tend to be looking at capturing information like keywords and questions. And on the right-hand side, you see the answers or the discussion of those keywords or questions being done. Now, the idea behind the Cornell method is quite simple. What you do is if you are attending a lecture, or if you're attending my lecture today, what you're looking at doing is you're all looking at making actual notes by taking down most of the keywords that I'm talking about, and the keywords are going to come on the left-hand side, so that when you see this keyword, it reminds you of something. So what you do is you basically write down the keywords on the left, and what these keywords define or talk about is done on the right-hand side using bullets. So the smaller columns on the left, so the smaller column on the left is essentially for questions, keywords, or important bits of information, so that when you're reviewing and revisiting this document, these keywords and comments or questions essentially would help you prepare or recall the topic which was being discussed. Now, on the right-hand side, what you do is you write down the discussion points related to those keywords, comments, or questions being asked, and you summarize them. You start writing them as bullet points. So when you're reviewing the notes, a brief summary of the keyword or the question being asked is seen on the left, and everything related to that which was discussed is seen on the right. So this allows you to essentially prepare better, I would say, in terms of doing it for the exams, because you have a question on the left and then you have answer on the right, or you have a keyword on the left and the description of those keywords on the right. And this was termed as a fairer or a quicker technique for students to be able to recall topics while they were reviewing them for examination preparation. Now, what we need to look at is that this system of note-taking encourages you to reflect on your notes by actively summarizing them in your own words. So you write a keyword here, and I might write research skills or research methods, and on the right-hand side, I would write in my own words, primary method, secondary method, tertiary method. And under primary method, I could do a hyphen, and I could say primary methods are methods like interview, focus group, they are questionnaires, feedback taken through surveys, and they would be primary methods. Secondary methods, I could write them as data which is collected through reports, published reports, articles, journals, or from government agencies, and that would classify me as secondary resources. So sometimes it makes it easier for us to remember, and also to successfully look at passing the exam, or when we are looking at revising these topics. In the case of you doing the assignment or writing tasks for the assignment, it becomes easier for you to recall what was discussed during the session. And this method would generally be termed as the Cornell method. Now, there is what is called the mind mapping method. And mind mapping method of note taking tends to be a method in which you basically create, you start with the main topic, essentially. That main topic of discussion you circle, and then you start drawing lines and circles in and around, let's say, the main topic, which basically are then connected through lines. So here, in the mind mapping method, the main idea is to highlight the important facts that show the overall structure of the subject or the thing that you are discussing. So, for example, I might say that I'm going to discuss research skills. So research is in the center. Then I draw out 1 line, 2 line, 3 line, 4 line, and I'll say, okay, primary, secondary, and tertiary research. Then within primary, I'll circle it again, and I'll basically elaborate that into different methods. And that would tend to be, the mind mapping method. So this method is quite popular with students, is because of the fact that you're able to basically relate topics by encircling the topic in circles and then joining them by lines, which shows their relative importance and connectivity to that topic which is being discussed. So this becomes a very, very important method for making notes, because of the fact that sometimes it is easier to do graphical representation of information, ideas, and facts, which allow you to recall some of these at a much quicker pace when you are noting them down. So this method would be, if I put it this way, that okay, if I do a circle here, and this is, say, for example, research, and then I draw a line, and this again I do a circle, which is primary research, and then draw a few lines. That research, primary research could be of 4 or 5 different types. Then I do secondary research, again a circle here, and then tertiary research, again a circle here, and I can keep expanding by noting down information in a visual, graphical, or, in a graphical represented manner, which allows me to, sometimes, remember some of these things on a much easier basis. And that is why the mind mapping method is also become quite popular. Now, this method is generally used, when you are trying to diagnose problems, when you're trying to research solutions to a particular problem, or when investigations are being done to find out what has led to this particular problem, or how has this particular problem arisen. And you start from the source and you start drilling down to try and arrive at a place where this problem would have originated. And this method tends to be mind mapping method. Now, there are other methods as well, but at the end of the day, what we want to know is that all these methods are basically used for making notes. They make your notes effective. They make notes effective in the sense that you can revisit them quite quickly. You can recall the information which was discussed. And obviously, because you're writing them in your own words in a specific method using either the outline method, mind mapping method, or the Cornell method, it makes it, let's put it this way, one of the usage that it makes it easier for you to recall the topic of discussion when it was discussed. Now, these methods have become structured techniques because sometimes if you pass notes on to your friends, relatives, colleagues within the organization, then if they understand these methods, which are now structured methods and are very widely accepted, it makes it easier for them to interpret some of these notes when they do receive them as copies, or you pass them as copies to them to say, okay, hey, you were not there in that meeting, but here's a copy of the notes which was done for that meeting, and you could visit some of these notes to bring yourself up to date with what was discussed in the meeting. And because the structure is there to taking notes, either using outline, mind mapping, or the Cornell system, this is where it makes it easier for them to interpret, when they receive a copy of these notes. Now, one of the last things before I would quickly discuss in terms of note taking as a process, before we go into the assessment criteria, would be to understand what are the 5 R's of note taking. So when we look at this as a process, of writing down information or noting the information down for the purposes of creation of records, the 5 R basically stand for record, reduce, recite, reflect, and review. So when you're looking at making notes, you're basically recording that information in a very legible manner so that it can be used in the future. So one of the first things that we need to keep in mind when we are looking at the process of note taking is to make sure that we are recording something which is legible and recording something which is accurate and meaningful so that it can be used in the future. We look at reducing. So the idea of note taking as a process is to summarize the bits of information which has been discussed either during a minutes of the meeting or a lecture like this that I'm giving. And here the idea is you want to look at a summary of what was discussed by referring to those notes. So here you would want to write them using one of these methods so that, if I have to literally write what I'm speaking in the form of this lecture, I would probably end up creating 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 word report at the end of it, but that is not something that you would be interested in going through again. What you're looking at and what you're interested would be to basically understand the grasp, you understand and grasp the exact meaning of what was discussed in the session. And for that, you would want to go through some of the summary bits of it, and they would be recorded as notes. And that is where the amount of material that you need to consume in order for you to understand the lecture is reduced, because you're documenting it using certain methods, which allows you to still understand the whole of the discussion which has happened during the lecture. Then when we talk about reciting and reflecting, here the idea is that we are looking at recalling the information and obviously noting it down in our own words without having to look at our notes or the text that we have done. So if sometimes I take notes, and the way I take it, it's not followed a particular method, then if I give those notes across to somebody else, what will happen is that they will have a bit of a problem in understanding how they have been taken. And in some cases, what tends to happen is that people decide to take their own notes because, they have their own way of writing it. And obviously, if they have to revisit it or go back to it, they can understand their own notes quite well rather than looking at somebody else's note. Reflection and review is an important process because reflection tends to be, about your own opinions and ideas in terms of what was discussed, what kind of questions were raised, what were the answers to those questions. And obviously in some of the classroom-based activities or activities that we normally do in meetings, seminars, trainings, you would generally see that, towards the end of the discussion, your trainer or your lecturer would essentially ask you to summarize what you have learned within the session. And this tends to be a bit of a reflection to say that you need to have your own connotation or meaning of the discussion which has been done and see how it benefits you. And then sometimes we also do the review, and this review tends to be, about going through what we have written, so that at a later stage, when we are able to, when we are looking at recalling this data, we are able to exactly recall it and the way and recall it in the same way as it was being discussed during the lecture or in the training or the seminar or webinar that you have attended. And this tends to be making sure that you are basically noting down the key bits and information which were required to be discussed, or which were required essentially during discussion, so that at a later stage, again, when you recall them, you know exactly that this has been done and you have recorded them accurately. So just like, if I would say, these are tips that you need to keep in mind when you look at the process of note taking, and these are termed as 5 R's. Like the person-centered approach, which has become a methodology. Similarly, this is like 5 R's of note taking, and as long as you're aware of these 5 R's, and when you're making notes, this is what would generally be useful. Now, let's go across to the 2 assessment criteria in this learning outcome. One of the assessment criteria talks about note-taking of information from a variety of sources using active listening and reading strategies. So here, what we mean by active listening, let's listen into a particular video. And that video would basically give us some idea in terms of, how the process of actually active listening works. So I'm going to play this video. If you give me a second, what I would want to do is basically discuss with regards to this particular video, and then we'll go into the learning outcomes.
Spreadsheets actually get started, spreadsheet, and
think about how much information you get every day from listening. Your boss, your colleagues, your clients, and your suppliers may communicate with you often. So will your family and friends. How much of what all these people say do you pay attention to? How much are you actually remembering from these conversations? Chances are it's a lot less than you think. A lot of times we act as if we're listening to the other person, but the reality is that our minds are racing to other topics or already planning what we're going to say in return. This means that we can miss important things that the other person is saying. Active listening is when you make a conscious effort to hear and understand people so that you get the complete message. There are several things you can do to become an active listener. First, you need to pay attention. We know this is a bit obvious, but it's the most important part of active listening. For instance, make eye contact with the person talking to you. Ignore outside factors like other conversations so that you can focus solely on what the person is saying. Most importantly, put your own thoughts on hold. Resist the urge to start planning out what you're going to say in return. You also need to show the other person that you're listening to them. You could nod your head, smile, and say yes occasionally. All of these signals let the other person know you're still with them. Providing feedback on what the other person has just said is another important part of active listening. For instance, all of us hear information through our own personal filters and judgments. This can affect our understanding. To make sure you heard and understood the message correctly, paraphrase it or repeat it back to the person. You can also ask questions to get more information, but make sure that you listen to what they're saying before you plan your response. You also need to avoid interrupting when they are speaking. Once they're finished, you can respond appropriately and with an honest answer or opinion. Active listening is a skill that all of us should use more often. The better you are at listening, the more information you'll receive. This can pay off with big rewards in your career and strengthen your bonds with family and friends. You can find out more.
So basically, as you can see, this as a process in this video has been explained from a point of view of, why active listening is important and what do you need to do to become an active listener. Sometimes, and the three important points, if we recall what she mentioned, was that one, we need to be paying attention. And the second is sometimes in the anticipation that what our responses are going to be, we already start planning and, start going away from the conversation or the listening that we are doing. And the third tends to be the bit in terms of understanding that if we have body language and, obviously, if we start interrupting the person by asking questions, then obviously in this case, the process of active listening can be seen to be broken. So when we talk about active listening, there are three important A's that we need to know. And because this is a bit theoretical, what we need to do is understand the process of active listening and obviously look at just keeping this in mind, that when we are talking about active listening, it can be broken down into three main elements. And these three main elements tend to be the attitude, attention, and the adjustment. So when you're sitting, and when she talked about that you should make eye contact, this is about, making adjustments. When she talks about that you need to be able to then give feedback or not interrupt and listen in carefully, that is the process through which she's referring to is attention. And when we talk about the attitude, what we need to be doing is, attitude is that first we need to be paying attention to and listening to what the other person is saying, rather than in the process of anticipation, start preparing our responses and get a bit worked up to say, okay, when she stops or when he stops, this is what I'm going to say. And that is where you start to disengage from the process of active listening. So these three A's are quite important because of the fact that when we are sitting in a meeting, we are sitting in a conference, in a lecture, or in a webinar, and sometimes when you're taking in the information, these three A's are quite important. That means you're paying attention, your attitude in terms of being fully, present in that location rather than being physically present and mentally somewhere else. And the third being adjustment that you're able to do. So if I'm doing a webinar right now, the adjustment would have been tuning into your microphone or switching on your video, making sure you're muted your microphone and, you're making some notes. This could be the attention that you're paying towards the lecture. And the adjustment that you're making is obviously from a point of view of technology in this case. But if you were present in the room, the adjustment would have been your sitting posture, your eye contact, or maybe nodding your head off and on during the course of the discussion or during the course of that, discussion or presentation which is happening, which basically acknowledges that you are actively participating in that meeting or in that discussion within the class. Now, this is one side of when we say note-taking. Now, the other bit that we also need to understand is that why is note-taking quite important? Note-taking is when you are actually listening into somebody. So this process through which we are able to do is basically looking at effective listening, and we are basically taking in information which is being spoken about or discussed or shown to us in a variety of ways. It could be graphs, information, maybe on a TV, or maybe the presenter is presenting and visually you are basically taking in this information. Now, you are also required to do note-taking as a process when you are reading. So, for example, sometimes when you get medical records to read, or for example, when GPs essentially or consultants essentially get medical records to read, they are also then looking at the process of note-making, or in this case, because they are actually reading, nobody is narrating it out to them. It is basically actively reading the material yourself, and then looking at summarizing the important bits that you would feel you would need to know before you go into that operative procedure. So in some cases, when we talk about the process of note-taking, the listening side of things tend to be one, and the reading side of things tends to be the other. So there are lots of different techniques through which note taking can be done through reading, but the four main techniques tend to be skimming, scanning, intensive scanning, and extensive scanning. Now, when we talk about these four different bits, we are aware of, I think, skimming and scanning, because this is something that we do pretty much day in, day out in most of our, day in, day out operations on a daily basis. Now, when I say skimming, sometimes what happens is if you're given a handout, or if you're going through a piece of information which is on a poster or an article, what you tend to do is you basically go through the article quite quickly. You look at visually going through the main bits of the main points of the which have been advertised, either in paragraphs or bullet points. And what you try and do is basically go through this bit quite quickly to see whether it's of interest or whether it is something which allows you to capture a lot of information. So when I talk about skimming, as a process, in terms of maybe just the definition of the word skimming, skimming tends to be basically the act of reading something quite quickly. And here, the idea of reading something quite quickly is to take notes of only the important points when you're reading that particular context, whether it could be a document, a letter, an article, a medical record, it could be anything. But the central idea of skimming being that you're trying to read only the important bits of information, and that too quite quickly. Now, when we talk about scanning, scanning tends to be a process that you are looking at basically trying to find information within a particular document. So when I talk about scanning in particular, this tends to be you're trying to look at the parts of the whole story, or maybe look at the parts of an article, or whatever it is. You're looking at a record, an article, or a piece of news or newspaper, and what you're doing is basically looking at carefully detecting some of the important features which are given in that handout, article, patient record. And they could be things like a picture which catches your attention. It could be a few bullet points. It could be the way in which the writing is, the color of the writing. In some cases, if it has been written in red, it catches your eye quite quickly, or it differentiates, from the other. Sometimes when you're shown an image and you're shown a number of images, you might just catch the glimpse of only one of those images which catches your attention because it was maybe depicted in a different color or maybe in a different fashion, and that tends to be scanning. So scanning involves getting information through your eyes, and what you're basically trying to do is get the main bits of information that you're trying to main bits of information that you're basically trying to collect, and that is being done from a point of view of scanning that document or scanning that record. So one bit is sometimes when you're out and about and you're, say, for example, scanning, you are maybe in front of a bookshelf and you're looking and trying to buying a book. And what you would do is basically go by doing a bit of scanning. So what you will do is either start with the alphabetical order, or go by the author, or go by the genre in which the book is being, listed, or basically highlighted for sale, for example, on certain shelves. So you might go with fiction, you might go with, say, for example, drama or something like that, and you would go in and quickly scan through either the genre or alphabetically, or see where the the books and how they have been laid out. And that process would be scanning. So when you get into a store, for example, when you get into a shopping mall, you're basically looking at scanning where to find the trolley, or which is the fastest way to the till, or in some cases, which till is not very busy, or where do you want to start shopping. So what your brain is essentially doing is basically scanning. And what then you would do is you would, effectively find a way through which you would maybe start doing that activity first, or maybe take up that activity or that path first, go down that path because you feel that, okay, this is having less number of customers, or maybe less crowded. And that is why you would basically go into with the process of scanning. Now, when we talk about intensive reading, here your main aim is to basically read the topic, in detail. So here you want to retain the importance of what you important, let's say, contents of the topic that you've read. So sometimes you would see that if you're going through, say, for example, patient records, or if you're going through certain, records which have been given to you, then in those cases, what you do is, rather than go through it again and again, what you would do is, in the first reading itself, you would basically do an intensive reading. That means you look at everything in detail, and you will spend a bit of time on it to try and remember as much as possible by reading that record. Now, in those cases, what you would generally see is that when you do this as a process, wherein you're going to be spending more time, and your time which you're going to spend in terms of going through that document, or going through that record, would help you retain more information than in the processes when you did skimming, or than in the processes when you looked at scanning. And this tends to be wherein you're trying to retain or trying to assimilate large amounts of information, which in some cases you would want to do because you do not want to revisit that particular record again, or that article, or that piece of information again. Now, when I talk about extensive reading tends to be a process in which you're going to be looking at reading for pleasure. So sometimes when we look at reading novels, sometimes when we look at reading books, sometimes when we look at reading, say, for example, documents which are reports, articles, journals, here what you're trying to do is you're trying to, assimilate knowledge. You're trying to, obviously gain more information, which will make you either, say, for example, which will give you more information and either move you towards becoming an expert, or maybe somebody who's having a lot of information in that field. So as a person, you would be seen as somebody who has lots of information of that particular area. So in this case, you do the process which is called extensive reading. And extensive reading tends to be wherein you are doing it for the purposes of gaining knowledge, for enjoyment. And in this case, the other bit is, the main process tends to be that you're trying to assimilate information. That means gain and retain information for the purposes of knowledge, which could be used in the future. And this requires a lot of concentration when you're trying to read. And generally speaking, when extensive reading is done, you normally would sit, in a quiet place or in a quiet corner, or you would generally do the reading, by yourself, so that you have no interruptions or very few interruptions. And the concentration that you have is the highest when you're trying to retain information or, assimilate information. So these four tend to be different techniques through which you also look at note making. So what tends to happen is that when you're trying to make notes, skimming is one such example of skimming I would give you is when you're trying to revise for exams, or when you're trying to revise for, say, an important test or some bit of information that you need to quickly revise. You're going to skim through it and go through some of the details. Scanning tends to be when you're looking for information, and your main intention here is to basically scan for important pieces of which will help you recall that information. So here it could be you are searching for something, or it could be that you are basically scanning for important symbols or signals which would help you recall that information in the future. Intensive reading tends to be wherein you are basically looking at spending a lot of time, and this is being done primarily for the purposes of making sure that you are able to recall, remember, and record this information from a point of view of usage in the future. And this would mean you are going to go through large amounts of information. So, for example, solicitors, detectives, some people within some professions have to go through lots of information in order to create a case history or a case record. And in those cases, they do what is called intensive reading. Extensive reading tends to be exactly opposite of intensive. It is generally done for the same reasons, but it is more done for pleasure and obviously for the purposes of gaining knowledge for personal or at the individual level. And that is where you would do and use this process of extensive reading. Now, any questions on this so far? Any questions that have come to your mind after we have covered this topic of note taking and note making in particular? Okay, let's go to the second assessment criteria, which talks about paraphrasing and summarizing the information. Now, one of the key things that we want to look at is, when do we paraphrase, let's say, or need the, have a need for paraphrasing. So paraphrasing in general basically means that you're rewording or rewriting something which has been, rewording something which has either been spoken or written. And that is something which is, you're doing it in your own words. And that is what the meaning of paraphrasing is. So an example of paraphrasing that we get to see is when you do your assignments and you're quoting an author, or maybe a scientist or a psychologist, or somebody who has basically come up with a framework or a definition. You are basically going to either quote the person by using direct quotes, or you're going to write the same thing in your own words without altering the meaning of what has been said. And that process is going to be something called paraphrasing. So paraphrasing is basically rewording information to shorten it, to simplify it, while at the same time maintaining the same meaning. The sanctity of the information remains while keeping the sanctity of the information the same. And paraphrasing can be done, as an alternative route to quoting somebody directly. That is, you're not wanting to copy the exact original words of what has been said by somebody. What in turn you are going to do is basically describe the same thing or the event or the process, but basically do it in your own words and in a simplistic manner to a certain extent. And that would be the process of paraphrasing. Now, sometimes you would see that, paraphrasing would be done wherein you're reading articles, news, briefings, or, for example, this is something that I put, as a task on the slide, is that if you listen into a press conference which is being done, and then towards the end of it, you have to summarize the press conference or the main points which were discussed, or questions which came up in the press conference, and what were the responses to it. You would basically go about summarizing it in your own words, and that process is going to be termed as, paraphrasing. Sometimes what you will also do is basically read an article. So when we talk about case studies in general, sometimes when we have to write reports and you have to go through case studies, another example that I would give is that when you go through these case studies, what you then try and do is basically write down the context of the case studies in your own words without altering the meaning of it. And that process will also be termed as paraphrasing. So paraphrasing is basically done in the context. Literally, it would mean rewording of information which is either written or spoken, and it is done in your own words and in a simplistic manner. And the idea thereabouts is to summarize the information in your own words, and that process through which you are able to convey the same meaning of the information without altering what was said originally would be the process through which you would look at paraphrasing. So there are some important bits that you could do with regards to the assignment. In this case, when we look at task 2 of the assignment brief, so what I'm going to do is primarily upload, I'm going to show you a template which I'm going to upload, and this template would be basically looking at covering the task 2, which is primarily the learning outcome 3 in terms of note taking. And here the idea is the task is going to be talking about collate key pieces of information from variety of sources. And this would mean using this template. So in one of the sources of information that I've given is that, imagine if you were listening to a press conference, and this is a chart which is being shown by Office of National Statistics, which is being quoted in the conference. This is a graph which basically shows information, and what you need to then do is listen into, and by reading this particular article which was printed, the link is also given, what you're going to do is summarize it and paraphrase it and then write it in your own words. Now, this basically shows information being collected from variety of sources, and that is the task which is related to this particular assignment. In this unit, task 2 of the assignment relates to summarizing information from variety of sources. So this is one source, which is basically a graph, and I'll upload this template. The second source is a table. So this is data which I've taken, from the Office of National Statistics. One of the presentations which was given out as a meeting during the meeting and briefings about the COVID-19, pandemic. And what they've shown is basically rates of infection and obviously how the virus is affecting the different age groups in terms of different people in different age groups of people. So here, what you need to be able to do is basically, again, read from this link. And what you're looking at is summarizing and paraphrasing the information or the summary of it, of what this table actually shows. So we are looking at different sources of information. One source, graph. Second source, table. And then the third source that we are talking about is a flow chart. So this is looking at three different parts. The third being something which is visually appealing and depicting the information visually. And this shows the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on mental health. And here again, after reading this flow chart, what you have to do is summarize it in 30 to 50 words. Summarize it in your own words. I would say not more than 30 to 50 words. And that is to say, what are the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on a patient's mental health? And this would then help us in completing the task which is given in the assignment brief, for this unit. And that will be task 2 in particular, and that would be related to the learning outcome 3. Now, this template, as I mentioned, I will make sure that it's uploaded on Moodle so you can use it to complete that part of the assignment, which is task 2 of the unit. So any questions on this so far? Any questions, anybody?
No.
Okay. Now, let's go across to covering learning outcome 4. So give me 1 second. Just stay online. And what I'm going to do is basically start with learning outcome 4. So just all of you stay online. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so let's start with learning outcome 4, and let's go across to the indicative spec first. So in learning outcome 4, what I'm going to do is also show you another document that we're going to use as a template. And the idea is to now put into practice what we've learned with regards to different types of research and obviously, the bits that we've done in terms of primary, secondary research. So here, if I just get 1 minute, what I want to be able to do is, yep. Right. So basically, if we see learning outcome 4 actually focuses on, there are few things that I think you should pay slight bit of attention to. Now, if you look at be able to, this is something which I mentioned earlier as well. Be able to means we are going to be required to do something in practice. So be able to essentially means we are going to be, looking at having to do it, or basically looking at, completing a particular task by showing it practically. And that is where it stands when we say the knowledge descriptors for this particular unit. The learning outcome is focused on be able to. That means it is asking you to show and basically do something practically. In the second one, it was know how to. That means it was more focused on you just getting knowledge, and that was primarily to understand in detail by theoretically going, understanding the meanings of what was required to be covered. So here, the idea is to practically know and gain knowledge so that you could essentially help, maybe develop a skill in the future. Now, again, in the third learning output was be able to. That is why we need to collate and show that how do we understand variety of sources of information, and that's why the template, graph, table, and flow chart. and that would be required for you to interpret using those using those three different types of information being presented on the template. So you are basically doing be able to. So again, in this particular task, it is be able to. That means we have to go about and create a plan of research or do research essentially. So it's not going to be theoretical. It is going to be something which is practical, wherein we are able to then go about and create a plan for research. Now, the fourth learning outcome is about creating a plan for doing research on a chosen topic in health and social care. So this is a very vast area. So what we want to be able to do is put what we've learned in learning outcome 2, which is types of research methods, and then put it into practice by trying to take up a small mini project for research in the field of health and social care sector. Now, in the learning outcome 4, we will be required to essentially create a draft proposal for research. So here you're going to be looking at creating a proposal, and a proposal for research will include things like aims, objectives, rationale of the research. You are going to be looking at what are the sources from which you will collect the information. And then towards the end, you are also looking at writing down what could be the proposed conclusions that you expect to draw from that research. You're not going to be looking at detailing out findings or get into the findings in this learning outcome, but this is more about creating an outline of that research plan or a mini research project that you're going to do within the health and social care sector. And what we're going to do is learn about how to create a proposal, and the proposal of it would include things like aim, objective, rationale of research. We look at things like what could be the conclusion that we are expected to draw, what are the sources from which we will look at gathering this information. And if at all you are looking at doing a primary research, then we also would look at very briefly defining the research methodology, whether you'll do primary research, secondary research, what methods of what would be the methods of collecting information, and you will outline them just in your research proposal. Now, once this has been done, you would also take feedback from the tutor, which is myself. So what you'll do is draw up this proposal. You will send it to me for feedback. I'm going to give you some feedback on it, whether the topic is okay, whether it's too generic, whether it's too big a topic. Because remember, we are doing this at level 3. So here the idea is to keep the topics, when I say topic, I mean the objectives of the research to be very simple and narrow, because the idea here is to understand how do we go about creating a research proposal. So I'm going to give you some feedback on it. If everything is fine, and I give you some feedback to make some changes, you make those changes, make those improvements. And then in the 5th learning outcome, you're going to be finalizing your research proposal into a mini research project. Now, 2 points which I would stress here again would be, because we are looking at doing this at level 3, the proposal is going to be 1 or 2 pages maximum, wherein you are going to create an outline of how and what the research is going to be, covering 5 different areas, which I'll explain when we discuss this in the presentation. And then in the learning outcome 5, you're going to be presenting the outcome of your research and how you've gone about doing it. And this is going to be documented as a mini research project report, which will not be more than 200 to 250 words. Again, about maybe I would say research proposal about 1 page, and the research proposals outcome, which is the mini research project that you present, which in the health and social care sector, I would say maximum about 2 pages. And that would be doing the tasks for learning outcome 4 and learning outcome 5. Now, there are some merit and distinction criteria. So the merit criteria, just to repeat, talks about taking feedback from the tutor to be able to make improvements on your research proposal and the research draft. And in the 5th learning outcome, it talks about presenting the work orally. That means sometimes when we do these research projects, in order to present the research that has been done, you are also faced with the task of doing viva voce. That means question answer sessions towards how did you go about, or when in some cases at higher levels, when you do your research, you generally have a panel, or your teachers or your lecturers, they form a panel, and towards the end of your research, they will put you to test in terms of finding out details about how did you go about doing it, what were the problems you faced, what were the ethical considerations. So there is a question answer session, or viva voce as we call it, which happens, and that tends to be the presentation of your research, the findings. So maybe a 5-minute presentation that you would do about, how did you go about conducting the research? What were the important areas that you considered? What were the areas, maybe in short, what you're trying to do is present the outcome of your research, and that presentation of the outcome of your research orally would be basically meeting the merit criteria. So in this case, the audience could be myself and some of the other colleagues which are present on the lecture. So obviously in this case, if, for example, Christina is presenting, Jefferson, Atinuke, some of the others like Solar, they are all, are a part of the audience in terms of, looking at or hearing into or listening into the presentation of, say, Christina. And when they ask questions, with regards to the presentation, that would generally be, considered the fulfillment of the merit criteria. Now, in the distinction criteria, we are basically looking at presenting that report in a professional manner, which would be classed as a research project. So here is where we will discuss about things like referencing towards the end. How many resources have you looked at? What resources have you looked at for collating data so that they're factual and accurate? And then you're also looking at presenting the report in a way wherein it covers the 5 or 6 chapters that we normally see in a research project, things like introduction, literature review, research methodology, data collection and findings, conclusion, towards the end, recommendations, and then ethical, considerations for doing the project. And in some cases, we also mention future areas of research, or if somebody is to pick up that report and then do further research on it or further refinements and take it further for development, then that will be future areas that sometimes we also recommend that, okay, because of time constraints or because of this, I was on money constraints, time constraints, ethical considerations, I was only able to complete the research to this level, but should somebody look at taking the research further, these are the other areas they could get into, and that those could be future areas of suggestive research, and that could be also given in that structured report. So there are 6 or 7 sections in that report. So obviously, if somebody is looking at meeting the distinction criteria, they would be looking at putting the contents of the report in these 5 or 6 different sections, and that would be for the purposes of meeting the distinction criteria. And what we are going to do is discuss 4 and 5 together. But briefly, what I'm going to do is switch you over now to a presentation that we use to discuss, the criteria's, the assessment, the learning outcomes 4, 5, and 6 together. But today, what we're going to do is discuss only 4, and if time permits, go to 5. But 6 is something that we will do next time, because that is a reflection to what you have done in this unit, and that would be done separately. So I will keep that out, for a separate session. So if we quickly go through some of the bits in terms of what we are looking at in Learning Outcome 4, basically we are looking at creating a draft research proposal. And in this case, in order to create a draft research proposal, what I would suggest is that there are lots of different topics that you can go and do research about in health and social care. But because, again, of the time, keeping time constraint in mind, keeping that we are doing a level 3 course in mind, I have got certain websites from which you can actually go in and look at some research reports. So these websites include health.org.uk, and there are a number of research projects which are listed here. And you can also go to another site, which is gov.uk Scotland, which is the NHS Scotland website. And there are, lots of research projects listed by topic, which are specifically in the health and social care sector. And you could look at maybe even potentially going through some of the publications which publish research reports every month, and read pick one of that report to be able to, formulate your own research project. Now, There are other popular topics as well, and there are topics that are picked up, from these sites. It could be things like impact of COVID-19 on your business. It could be, somebody in the UK, opting out of organ donation. And obviously, sometimes it does happen that when you sign up to the National Health Service, this is considered as a part and parcel of that you signing on to the National Health Service to be able to receive health benefits, or when you take facilities or use facilities like GP surgeries and things like that, you are basically by default becoming an organ donor. But if you need to opt out of it, then there's a survey or a form that you need to fill, and that could be one of the reports that why people sometimes opt out for organ donation. And there is some sort of a rapid evidence review report which has been published for certain cultures and backgrounds. Then I've just picked up randomly a few: understanding nurse retention rates and impact on patient safety, and obviously the NHS 111 service for children and young people. You could actually go on to this website. If I open this up and share my full screen, what my suggestion would be that you should be able to pick out something that is of your interest and then develop that into a bit of a research proposal. So let's look at this holistically. I'm going to share the full screen. It might look a bit small in some cases, but if I look at opening this particular website, this is the website which is the Healthcare Foundation, or the Health Foundation, sorry. And there are lots of different research which are listed alphabetically. So my suggestion here would be, if you look at, say, end of life care, just as it's a very broad topic. Now, within that, there are lots of different types of research projects which have been done over the years. And as you can see, you can choose a particular topic, which is either data and analytics related to policy or workforce or public health. So if I just choose public health and I basically click more, there are a few which come up. And if I choose one, which is health of places and health and outcomes of individuals on those places, maybe something simpler. So understanding inclusive growth and health in practice, if I click on this read more, what will then happen is you'll be looking into reading this bit of research report, which is a bit of a summary provided here. And should you wish to read it in a bit more detail, then there are options to download this or maybe go on to and do a further reading. So the idea here would be to basically look at shortlisting one area of research that is of interest to you within the health and social care sector. And with that in mind, what we are going to do is basically create a research proposal or a plan to go about doing the research and writing a report. Now, for this, I have created a bit of a template, and this is a template which basically looks at, don't worry about the task. I think naming of the task we'll do accordingly. But this task is basically about creating a research proposal. So you can write your name here, the topic of research, what organization or why, what is the topic in detail, maybe 2 or 3 sentences, or the topic of research that you need to write here. You need to write maybe 1 or 2 objectives in terms of why you are carrying out this research, what is the purpose of this research. So I've created a bit of a template which is going to allow you to write 20 to 30 words in each of these boxes, and that would be hitting the criteria 4.1, which is creation of a plan, drafting a research proposal, and the third, when I give you feedback on this, to accept this proposal before you complete it and produce a final report, would be looking at meeting the learning outcome 4. So this template will focus on asking you specific questions about what is your research topic, what is the sector, what are the key objectives of research, what is the rationale of the research, why are you looking at focusing on this specific area, what are the key issues that you're investigating, and what could be the broader significance of doing this research. At the end of it, what are you going to come out with a conclusion on this research? And then you're going to mention whether you're going to do primary or secondary research, which is desk-based, or looking at doing field-based research. And then what are the sources of information that you are going to use to collate this information? And then what could be the conclusion that you're expecting to draw from this research is going to come across in this particular template. Now, if we go through a bit on the slides that I've created, what I've asked you to look at is identify aims and objectives of the research. So, for example, a simple aim and objective of the research is I want to find out the impact of COVID-19 on the business, or impact of COVID-19 on society in general. Now, if I say society, this will become a very wide topic. So the idea there is to narrow it down to a particular area which will focus you on not, basically focus you on doing a research for level 3 at the level at which we are studying the course. Now, I don't want to be looking at, very broad topics, because that would mean you have to read a lot, you have to collate a lot of data, information, and then summarize it, which is going to be like a proper research project that we normally do 6, 7, 8,000 words. So this is a part of an assignment, one of the learning outcomes in the assignment, and within that learning outcome, it's one of the tasks that we need to complete. So here, the idea is to narrow it down to a certain, basically narrow it down to a certain area with one objective or two objectives at the max in mind, which will basically mean that you are doing this as an activity as against an assignment of the whole unit. And here, what I would suggest is, in terms of some, collection of research methodology, when you look at primary and secondary, my suggestion would be look at secondary research, because of the fact that you're going to be basically collating data and compiling that in your report. Sorry, so in this case, that data that you're looking at compiling is going to essentially come from various sources. It could be articles, journals, maybe the website that I've given an example of. And when we look at that, the idea there would be to primarily read that piece of research and then look at summarizing it in your own words. So if I talk about the impact of COVID-19 on businesses, I would look at the impact of COVID-19, say, say, for example, in Manchester. And in particular, when I narrow it down to Manchester, rather than just say society, that is very broad, but I've narrowed it down to a city, and in particular, I can even narrow it down into my community or in my village or in my town. And that would make it accessible and easy enough for you to be able to get data, because sometimes you'd be able to get data from people by listening into them, asking questions. Sometimes it could be from local newspapers or information which has already been published on a blog or a website, and it'll be easy for you to collate. So go with secondary research. That would be advisory or recommended. But if you decide to go primary, you would need a longer time frame or a duration to be able to complete and draft this proposal, which is also fine. But this is something which is down to you in terms of which approach you take. Now, when we traditionally look at doing research, and should you go down the route of doing primary data collection, you would be required to either create a survey or an interview. Now, when we look at survey or an interview, sometimes what you do is you create Google questionnaires to be able to send that across to your friends on Facebook or LinkedIn to collect information. You ask them to, basically look at completing this questionnaire because you're looking at doing or undertaking a research. So you send it to your near dear ones, your friends, your colleagues, and that process through which you ask them to, give you or provide information is basically collecting information firsthand. It is primary, and that is where it tends to be through a questionnaire or an interview or a survey. So in some cases, if you're going to go around the route of primary method, then the idea there would be in the research proposal itself, you need to be able to create a questionnaire. And that questionnaire could be an open-ended question, it could be a closed-end questionnaire, which would then be used to ask or create questions. Basically, questions will already be there. So you'll be looking at passing that information on to people who will be filling those up, those questionnaires, and so that you are then collecting data and information which can be analyzed at a later date. Now, when you draft your research, you're going to be drafting your research to include a few things. And that is where I've simplified this into this particular research proposal template. And if you fill this template up, this will do and become a part of your assignment because you've done this as using this particular template. So here, the idea is give a brief introduction of why you're doing this research, mention the aims and objectives, and then after the aims and objectives, do a bit of the rationale of why you're looking at doing this research, and then go into doing a literature review. So talk of what is literature review. It talks about what is the existing literature which is already present if there is an area of research that you have chosen. So if I talk about literature review, what that means is basically, you are looking at the existing data which is or work which is already available and is already published, and that is where you are looking at going through it in order to ensure that the research that you're doing is not repetitive and obviously is going to lead to some meaningful conclusion because that is information which is already available in the public domain. So written pieces of work that you're going to read through, like articles, journals, especially those which are going to be considered, something which have been validated by research agencies, which is where I would say articles and journals would come in. If you're compiling data using books or written material, which could be on website, this will all consist of, literature or evidence that you're collating to study about your research topic, and that process is called literature review. So any material which is available in the printed format or which has already been published in the past, and that material that you're going to review to go through and see if it is relevant to your research topic would be termed as what is called literature review. So here, maybe about 50 words in terms of how you would go about finding out, let's say, data which has already been published, which is related to your research topic, and how is it related to your research topic is what you're going to talk about in the literature review. Methodology tends to be how you would go about doing your research, whether you will follow primary or secondary method, and those detailing out has to be done here. And this is what I've covered, in terms of the presentation. But the presentation is slightly a bit more detailed, which is to give you a good understanding of how a research project is conducted. Sometimes when we are looking at doing or undertaking research, we also look at developing what is called a conceptual framework. And when we talk about a conceptual framework, we basically here try and, talk about bits which are going to be used as an analytical tool within the context of the research that we are doing. So normally a conceptual framework is drawn up wherein you have a dependent variable and an independent variable. And to give you an example, a dependent variable would be wherein, you are going to discuss, say, or undertake a research within a particular sector. So healthcare sector is a dependent variable. And when we talk about, healthcare sector is an independent variable because it's a sector in which there are lots of different types of professions and lots of different types of services. Now, within this particular independent variable, you're going to do a research on a dependent variable, which is basically like a COVID-19 pandemic. So when we talk about a conceptual framework, we are basically going to be looking at, designing, let's say, an analytical tool, which basically will talk about the way in which we'll go about doing the study, how would we go about conducting research in that study, and what are going to be the prospective problems or areas in the industry or the sector that we are going to be looking at for the purposes of study. And this is what we also sometimes represent as a pictorial diagram or a visual representation. And this visual representation is a representation of dependent and independent variables, which are going to be used to quantify the objectives of the research. And this is generally developed on the basis of existing literature or existing pieces of research studies which are already available to let's say to let's say confirm that the research that we are undertaking has meaning and is something of interest in the wider public domain. Now, there could be lots of areas of lots of areas in which conceptual frameworks can be done, and they tend to be environmental, population, and looking at building characteristics, and that is where the variables come into place. So for this particular task and order, if somebody refers to and talks about what is a conceptual framework, you should be able to say that, okay, this is a framework which is basically created for the purposes of study, and it collates or triangulates the sector in which we are undertaking the study, which is healthcare. What is the dependent sector in which you are going to do the research, which is, say, the pandemic, and then what are the various objectives that you're going to undertake for researching are going to be depicted using a visual representation, and that visual representation tends to be what is called a conceptual framework. Now, for going through this in detail, there is a handout which I'm also going to provide for those of you who are interested in understanding how research projects are done and what are these 5 or 6 various topics under which research projects are compiled and then presented. Things like introduction, literature review, research methodology, data collection and findings, analysis, and then finally recommendations and conclusions. This is a chapter which I'm going to extract from a book called Research Project, and I'm going to make that chapter as an extract available so that you can go through those 15-20 pages to understand and build an understanding in detail about how research and research projects are done. Whether you follow a primary research technique or you follow a secondary, but that is the process through which all research projects or informations which are published as outcomes of research project go through, and that is how they have compiled. So when we look at our task and assessment criteria, which is focused on creating a research plan, we are looking at in the context of health and social care. So use this template. This bit 4.1, 4.2, and 4M1 will get completed in this part. But for a broader understanding, we have to look at so that you have a broader understanding of how research and research projects are carried out. This is where you will need to go through some of these slides to ensure that you are aware of how this whole process works from a point of view of if at all you are sometimes, if at all in the future, if you are asked to undertake a research project, then you should be aware of how this would be done using this particular process and technique. Is that okay? So any questions on this so far?
No
Yes,
questions.
there is a question, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this research you're talking about with the website, are we going to do research on any topic we like, or just what you explained about the COVID-19 stuff?
No,
Or are you going to send us a research to do on our email? I don't understand.
Okay, so 2 things. Let me quickly revisit. Now, when you look at the understanding on the learning outcome, when we are looking at what the learning outcome is talking about, so the learning outcome to us is talking about understanding how do we draft research proposals. That's the learning outcome. So when we look at the learning outcome, we are focused on understanding the whole process, which is what is depicted in the presentation in learning outcome 4. Is that okay? So from a point of view of theory and understanding of what we have to do as far as studying the unit is concerned and the learning outcome 4 is concerned, which says be able to plan and draft a piece of research, we are going to go through the whole process. So from theoretical point of view, I should have a good understanding of how research is undertaken, how research is done, what are the various routes through which research is done, and that is going to be covered in learning outcome 4. That is the presentation. Now, second part of your question is, because as I mentioned earlier, this is at level 3, and we are not looking at, literally doing a research project, because this is one of the learning outcomes or one of the tasks that you're going to do in the assignment brief. It is not a unit on its own. Assuming if you were studying this at level 4, there is a specific unit which is called research project. And you have to go about doing a research project or for an area chosen of your choice within the health and social care sector. So because this is only a miniature part of the whole unit at level 3, what I've suggested is that when you go about doing this particular task and this particular task in the assignment brief for this unit, the idea would be to try and look at doing a secondary research and maybe look at some of the topics which could be smaller topics for research, because you're essentially looking at completing 3 parts to a task within the unit, not the whole unit. Is that clear? Does that answer your question?
Yes. Oh, sorry.
Jefferson, does that answer your question?
I'm not still too much clear about that anyway. But
okay, I'll explain. Let me explain another time.
Yeah. Okay, please.
What we are doing is we are studying this unit called academic and research skills. Okay. Now within this unit, one of the learning outcomes talks about, or 2 rather, are talking about LO4 and LO5 are going to talk about how do we create a research plan and how do you present a research project. If you were to carry out that research plan, how would you then present that as a report?
Okay.
Now, because this is a part of the task of the whole assignment, the idea here is to not look at undertaking a full research in the health and social care sector or in the topic of your choice, because this is not a full unit. You're only doing it as a part of a unit. So here the idea is to limit the research proposal by looking at using the template which I've created, this one, and that will cover your LO4. So this template I'm going to make available on Moodle, and I'll also email this template to everyone so that when you're doing learning outcome 4 related tasks in your assignment brief, which is going to ask you to develop a research plan, this template will be used to complete that task. So to keep it narrow, focused, and also still hitting all the criteria of pass, merit, and distinction. Okay. And to keep this in mind, I have given you some suggested topics here on the slide. But if you want, you can go to some of these sites which are recommended. And these sites have lots of research reports which have been published in the health and social care sector. You can choose an area of your interest and something which is close to your heart. So, for example, I have done a lot of reading on COVID-19 pandemic, but now, with that being, which is like more or less under control, it's being talked about. I want to move on to another topic. So my topic could be something different. I might look at national health service, person-centered approach, health and social care sector in general, old age homes, whatever it is, end of life care, whichever is the topic close to your heart, you can go to these 2 sites, which will give you a lot of research reports. You can use one of the reports, download it, and then read that report to fill this as a template. Because, you're not doing the research yourself at this level. You're not basically going to spend 2-3 months to do the research. So the idea thereabouts is to look at sites where research reports are published, read it, contextualize it, and then bring it into this document so that you're able to do the assignment.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. No problem. Any other questions? Feel free to ask.
I'm okay, thank you.
Another thing, last time you said you want to send this to I never received any document from you. I don't know if you got my email right.
I got your email today. All documents and other bits are sent by IT. If I send an email, I will normally mark it to you. But even today's request for the learning outcome 2 recording, Generally, these are available on, Moodle. So I got your email and I
Okay,
replied and I forwarded that email on to Victor in IT to make sure that he's able to send that on to you for tomorrow. Learning Outcome 1 and Learning Outcome 2 recording.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Thank you about that.
Okay.
So
Yes,
here,
we need
what
that
you can,
recording. Thank you.
yeah. So what you can also do is, when I do my lectures, rather than have the Zoom recording deleted after a few days, because of the space constraint, what I normally also do is I will normally broadcast the lecture on YouTube. So what we are discussing, as you can see, is going live on YouTube. So when you go into youtube.com, which is our channel, UK Versity channel, so all you need to type is youtube.com/UK Versity Online, all one word. All lecture recordings are available here.
Okay.
Okay, so this is going live as of now on YouTube. Whatever we are discussing is live. So if you have to revisit and go back and look at the recording, all you have to do is go back to videos. And obviously the latest videos are coming up of every day, all the sessions which are being done. Right?
Oh,
So if you want to
Noted.
refer to academic research skills, learning outcome 2, as you can see, it was streamed 7 days back. So that is available here. If you want to go and see learning outcome 1, it will also be available as a video somewhere here. So they are all available on YouTube. Yes, if you want specific recordings, they are also put up on Moodle. Because on Moodle, what we do is we would normally put the recordings on which are without verbatim, like question answer session. Because sometimes if learners need to revisit those recordings, what will happen is that nobody will be interested in listening into the Q&A session. They want to just quickly go through the recording.
Yes.
So those are crisper versions which are put onto Moodle, so that at any given point in time, when you refer to those, you are basically referring to just the recordings of those units without the verbatim or the Q&A which is built in. And that is why you would see these recordings are slightly, crisper, 30, 35 minutes, 40 minutes maximum.
Yes.
Is that okay? So they are available. They are available to you. Yes, go on.
Sorry, the slides, are they actually available on Moodle too? The slides.
Yeah, they're all available on Moodle. All slides are available on Moodle. So if you look at today, we have discussed learning outcome 3. If I click on LO3, this LO3 presentation is here, what we've discussed. Right? Sometimes these presentations are slightly updated, because we will keep updating them 12 weeks down the line to say, make sure that they are, up to date. They are not very old. If changes happen, sometimes we would basically make changes to those presentations. And obviously then the recordings will also change to reflect that updated presentation. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Right. So this particular unit maybe would have been delivered by Anjum last time. And that is why you see some differences, that he's added a few bits, before what he has discussed. But most of the main contents of the presentation, would be the same, because sometimes different lecturers deliver it in a different way.
Yeah.
And that is why also these slides are slightly, altered. And the presentations that you are going to see will be having the recordings of the, the recordings will be of the presentations which you see. Okay.
Yep.
So one thing that I would suggest for the duration of your course, you might want to subscribe to the channel, YouTube channel. Go in and subscribe, because if any new video comes on, you would probably end up getting an email, and that would mean that you could basically get a copy of that lecture pretty much from the YouTube video itself, because you would know that this video has been, put up on YouTube.
Noted. Yes.
Is that okay? So this recording of the video, the link to the YouTube and this research proposal, I will send over to everyone on the email so that you have it. And this is what you would attempt at some stage when we do the assignment for this particular unit. So if I just, while we are at this particular topic, if I just quickly look at the assignment brief and show why the templating and why this I'm providing, is because it is going to make it easier when we look at dipping into the assignment at a later stage. So if you see the first one talked about, some of you have done it, your SWOT analysis, then being used to a skills audit being used later along with your SWOT analysis and SMART targets to create a PDP. And that would do your task 1. Now, when you develop a plan and you put a timeline to it to achieve that plan, helps you achieve the merit activity as well. Now, in task 2, which is what we discussed here, obviously it is task 2 here, but in the assigned unit specification, note taking is essentially learning outcome 3. So here it talks about note key points of information from a variety of sources. That is why I've spoken about a template, which I'm going to also send. And that template basically is your, the 3 types of sources of information. And then when you summarize by reading them in your own words, that will basically be completing this part of your assignment, task 2, by filling this template. Let me just bring that up as well, so that we are clear that that is what we are using. So this particular template is basically task 2 of your assignment brief. And I'm going to send this to you as a template in the email, because this will help complete task 2 of the assignment. Now, the third part which is where we are looking at carrying out the research project. So here it talks about develop a research plan, outline the process, first draft of your research work, list the resources, and produce it to a professional standard, is basically this template. So when you fill this up, you're going to be addressing all these tasks, which are 2.1, 2.2, 4.1, 4.2, and 5.1 in this particular document, which is this. That's why I named it as task 3. Is that visible? Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Yep. And then for the merit and the distinction task, what we have to do is produce this, what the proposal that we have created, we have to finalize this proposal into some sort of a research report. And that is what you will take you will present orally in a 5-minute presentation. And that would help achieve, 2D1, 5M1, and 5D1.
Yep.
So this will complete that part. And the last part is what we are going to do in the next session, which is looking at reflecting on our own academic progress in terms of what we've done in terms of development of PDP and also creation of the research proposal and the research project. And then when we reflect on the PDP to say that these are the activities I've completed, this is what has helped me now gain skills, and how I go about improving by my English language skills by setting SMART targets. The review part of it, which is the review, that means we have created a plan maybe 2 months back or maybe 4 weeks back, but now I'm reviewing that plan, and that review is basically reflection covered in learning outcomes 6, which is task 4 of the assignment. And that is what we need to cover next week.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah. So when we having this lecture next week, please?
This lecture next week is going to be at the same time, which is 3 p.m. For Sunday.
Okay.
We had some, clashes with some timings in the morning. And I'll be honest, and that is the reason why we had to shift it to, this particular time. So okay. I think from next week, that bit would be gone. We can definitely do this in the morning. But I would suggest rather than move the times around, if everybody is okay with it, we'll keep it for 3, so that, some of you, if you're going to church and other bits in the morning, then, you are free and to attend those activities and then maybe do the lecture with me in a relaxed fashion after 3 o'clock.
Yeah. Noted.
Good stuff. So what I will do is I will now end the session. I will send you 2 templates in the email, one for task 2, which is note taking, and one for task 3, which is research proposal. And these then can be used to complete these templates. You fill these templates, you complete them, and they will basically become a part and parcel of your assignment for this unit.
When are we supposed to submit the assignment, please?
The assignment submission can happen within 2 weeks after completion of your learning outcome 6. So assuming we complete this on the 10th, which is next weekend, we complete learning outcome 6, I would say you should be able to submit the assignment by 24th of July.
Okay, so I'm talking about to create a plan for research.
This, as I would say, is if you can complete both these 2 tasks, if I just quickly share the screen again, if you can complete task 2 and task 3 for next week and submit it to get some initial feedback. On task 2, there is no feedback required. So you have to just finish it and complete it. And that when you email it to us, I'm going to just put it in the folder so it will become a part of your assignment. Task 3, I would say, take about a week's time to basically shortlist on your area of research so that when you submit the proposal, you're able to then expand it and you have got everything, what sources you're going to collect the information from, you have the report with you, paraphrase it, so that you are able to then draft it into a professional report in the subsequent week.
Okay, thank you.
So either ways, I would say a week's time, you would not need to spend more than maybe 2 to 3 hours if you go to the topics on the website, which I've suggested.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, no worries. So take care, enjoy the rest of your evening, and I will catch up with you next week.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye for now.